What is happening, everybody? So I wanted to do a video for one of the viewers that had a question about tips and tricks for removing the intake manifold on a 392. And this is for Frederick Bryant, man. Thanks for the question, and hopefully this helps you out, bud. So really quickly, a couple of tools you are going to need. 1/4-inch drive, torque wrench, a little stubby here just for the removal of the intake manifold bolts. Couple of extensions. Torque spec on this is 12 Newton meters, if memory serves me correct. Believe it's 9 foot-pounds of torque is what you're going to torque them down to when you're done. You'll also need, get you a Sharpie so you can mark your bolts. I'm kind of anal about that, just to make sure bolts aren't backing off, as well as some blue Loctite. That'll pretty much be about all you need as far as reassembly. Now, as far as disassembly, you can go online. There's torque specs or the torque diagram for this intake manifold. Basically, you're going to torque them outside in, or I'm sorry, take them off outside in, and then you're going to install them inside out, torquing them down. I typically do at least 2 steps for stuff like this, so just a good recommendation. And just a little bit of thread lock on those bolts. Don't go crazy with them. But just some tips, tricks, pitfalls that I ran into, things like that. Let's go around to the passenger side over here. I'm going to show you a couple of things. So when you're looking underneath your car, by the way, I don't have covers on mine. I usually take those off. But anyway, you got to pull your covers off. This is about what you'll see if you've got a catch can. If not, then that will just route straight to the intake manifold. So try to get some decent lighting here for you, bud. All right, man. So this fucker's giving me attitude. Hold up. All right. Well, cool. All right, so you'll see some connectors in the back first. This is the stuff you're going to want to disconnect. The top one, pretty easy. The one for your variable intake runner link, though, is the one that's going to give you the most grief. You can't even see it over here, but it's got... It's the one, actually, I put some conduit on there just because I'm kind of sketchy about that kind of stuff. Anyway, it's up underneath here. You can see right there is the actual actuator right there in back. That that connector is a bitch to get off. So take your time with it. Just it's got the connector just like your just like one of your coil packs right here. It'll just pop up and that'll just pop right off. But same idea for that connector. It just does not want to come off. Take your time. Don't force it. It will eventually pop off. You're just going to have to be real, I'm not going to say gentle with it, but you're going to want to not yank on the thing. You just want to basically get on there and wiggle it until it kind of comes off of there. A second thing, you're going to have a vacuum line that's going to run back to your brake booster right here. You can see the plug. Hang on. Right there. That's your vacuum line. Remove it from there. Don't try to remove it from your intake manifold. That'll give you just... don't. Just remove it from there. Again, don't go yanking... I'm sorry. Don't go yanking on that thing. It will come off, but it's on there pretty good, man. So just know that. And don't forget to remove the clips that keep everything separated. Yeah, that was pretty funny. Ask me how I know what happens if you don't. So you can imagine that. Next thing you're going to want to do, creep back over here, the fuel line. Damn, I'm just awesome with this today. There, good that SRT hoods have that holder up there. Anyway, fuel line, pretty easy. This clip will pop off, and you kind of got to mess with it because it can. If you haven't done one of these before, it's going to act like a magic trick. Anyway, you're going to pop this thing back. Just make sure that this thing doesn't piece out that way. And then there's a clip right here. That's the clip that's going to be kind of a pain in the ass, but just a small flat screwdriver will get that taken care of. So once you've got that established and taken care of, obviously you're going to remove your all the intake boot and box as well. From that point, that's pretty much it. There's nothing else to removing it. What I like to recommend, oh, by the way, the the whole setup will come right off the car. Don't worry about, you know, removing the fuel rails until you get the thing onto a bench. The main thing, make sure you put some rags underneath that fuel rail where you're taking the fuel line off, just in case you've got pressure. Also, eye protection. If it does have pressure, you don't want that stuff spraying back in your eyeballs. And let's see, what else? The tough part's pretty much already done once you get to this point. If you want the extra room, you can remove the fuel rails. Just remember that once you get the rails off, get the injectors and all that, make sure none of the O-rings for the injectors stay down in the, my hand is just in the way. I'm doing awesome at this, aren't I? Make sure the O-rings aren't still in the manifold. Make sure you get a little bit of oil and oil those when you do reinstall them. And let's see, what else? Oh, so what I like to do, once you get back into torquing this thing back down, use your Sharpie. You can see some of the marks that I put on mine. I do apologize. I dropped this damn thing and it won't it won't focus anymore. So at least autofocus, and on this mode I can't focus it myself, but you can see the little white dot down there. I used you can either use a Sharpie to mark the manifold, or something like you know, like liquid paper or something like that, just to mark the bolts. That way when you torque them down, you can just check them, make sure they're not backing off with a few heat soaks. Do not make the mistake of chasing a torque spec with this intake manifold. It is polymer, and when you torque everything down the initial time, you'll go through a few heat soaks. Don't go back through this and try to retorque everything. It's a setup designed for a cold torque. If you try to retorque this while it's warm, the polymer will give a little bit. It'll give you a false torque reading, and you can actually over torque the bolts. And when the car does finally cool off, everything's still compacted, you can actually run the risk of stripping those threads that are in the head. Ask me how I know about that. So at any rate, you don't want to have to run down to the hardware store and get a helicoil just because you're working on a plastic intake. Something to remember if you're working on one of these. Little top tip for you. Of course, not to forget this clip, not to forget this connector for your throttle body. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Really not much else. I mean, if it's attached to it, remove it. This vacuum line, best thing to do with that is just to remove it and then fillet that back over there. And that's it on the tips and tricks on the intake manifold. Now, when you are putting it back together, what I like to do is I'll have a couple of the bolts. I'll set the intake manifold down lightly, and when I say lightly, I mean just put a little dab of oil on your finger and lightly oil the surface of the cylinder head. When you set the intake manifold back on, use a couple of the perimeter bolts, set them through there just more or less almost as dowels. After I set the intake manifold on, just finger tight, just so that they're still sticking up so they can move around. And then start your torque sequence from the inside and walk it that way out. So at any rate, I hope that helps you out, man. If you got any other questions, hit me up. Happy to answer them. That's a wrap. Adios.